For everybody that was convinced Oklahoma and Texas would be headed to the SEC in time for the 2022 season, does not look like you were correct. We have some news on that front today here on the channel. Welcome in. I'm John Kurtz. If you have not subscribed, please do consider clicking the subscribe button. I talk college football every day on this channel, which right now means conference realignment every day on this channel. I aim to give the Big 12 a voice. And the Big 12 felt like they didn't have much of one a couple of months ago when Texas and Oklahoma first announced that they were leaving. The tenor, the feel at that point in time seemed to be that Oklahoma and Texas would be getting out for the 2022 season. That does not appear to be happening, and we got another bit of evidence that would suggest that on Tuesday. Tuesday was the SEC schedule release, okay? Not quite the fanfare for the NFL schedule release, which honestly surprises me. That could be a whole other tangent. The SEC has to find a way to do this in the offseason, right? When there's nothing going on and you can do all the fanfare and have everybody pay attention to it and ESPN could show up. You can do it at a hotel in Hoover, Alabama. How about that? I digress. Anyway, the SEC released its schedule, not included for Texas and Oklahoma. So they have a whole schedule done up for next year. It does not include Texas and Oklahoma. It also does not include a ninth conference game, which is something that's been discussed and I'm sure will happen once Texas and Oklahoma do join the league because the SEC has such a great potential inventory of games there. Now, does this mean that Texas and Oklahoma for sure will not be in the conference in 2022? I suppose it doesn't, but there's a lot of backwork that does go into creating a schedule. Now, if the money is right, I understand. Money talks, they would do it again, but this is a tangible, substantial step that, again, would back up what everybody is saying right now, which is the right thing legally, that Texas and Oklahoma, right as of right now, won't be there until 2025, etc., etc. If you want to be very cynical and skeptical here and say, John, this still could happen in 2022, I will give you this quote from The Athletic and David Ubben that would suggest perhaps you are right. It says, for now, next fall is set. But if Texas and Oklahoma's arrival date is moved up, the league will go back to the drawing board on a new schedule in the beginning of a new era. And you guys know how I feel about The Athletic. Even as frustrating as it's been at points in the Big 12, I do trust their reporting. I certainly trust David Ubben, a guy who used to do the Big 12 blog on ESPN.com back in the day, right? So, yes, I'm sure if the SEC could get Oklahoma and Texas in time for 2022, they would redo the schedule. But still, this is another roadblock. It's another example of the fact that the process right now is not including moving toward that, it would appear, unless it's all happening in the cover of night and we have no idea at all. To me, the most likely scenario continues to be 2023 for the Texas and Oklahoma exit and entry into the SEC. I say that because let's just look at the evidence that we have right now. Think of everything that's in front of us right now. You know, I'll go back to this quote first. I think this really sets the scene. This was from a Saturday Down South article, and it quoted an anonymous SEC athletic director. This was right after the announcement of Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC, right after that Houston Chronicle story, before the announcement was even official on both sides. He said, quote, the expectation is for Texas and OU to play in the SEC in 2022. It doesn't do anyone any good for them to be in one conference and committed to another beyond that 1 year. That was the thinking at the time, for sure. But at the time, remember, a big piece of that is ESPN, who's heavily involved here, is plotting to work with the AAC and Mike Oresco to take down the Big 12. There's still this thought that the Big 12 may have other schools jump to other leagues. At that point, it was hopefully the AAC for ESPN's sake, and then Texas and Oklahoma wouldn't have to worry about any of that. They could just make the jump easily, right? So that's piece one. That didn't happen. And what also has happened is that the Big 12 has now solidified itself with the four schools, right? They've been able to add Cincinnati, BYU, UCF, and Houston to fortify themselves as a league. And even if there were another one or two teams to leave right now, Texas Tech AD Kirby Hocutt, Bob Bowlesby, they're all talking about still being open to further expansion. It's pretty clear that the league is not going to disband at this point, which takes away the easiest of options for Texas and Oklahoma to have gotten to the SEC in 2022. Another part of this is just I'm not seeing any reporting right now that would indicate that there are things happening behind the scenes pushing toward 2022 as the date. Fair point to counter and say Texas and Oklahoma sure kept it pretty under wraps that they were leaving for the SEC in the first place. I understand, but I would figure there would be something getting out at this point now that everybody is hyper vigilant of this story, and we likely would have heard or seen something. That to me is another piece of evidence here. Obviously, now we have the schedule. We have the SEC planning already to move forward without them, getting that plan set in place and ready to go and not holding up, waiting around. You would think if it were imminent, that they would be sitting around not quite as eager to get the schedule out and do all of that work only to have to redo it, right? And then on top of that, again, I know you can be cynical about this. You can point out the legal reasons why they're doing this, but just the public comments of Greg Sankey also do not speak to somebody who's expecting this to happen like that. For instance, he says, we've talked about the 25 season. Everybody has relationships, a lot of work to do. We're focused on 25. We wanted to be respectful, even though when you go through conference transition, people will throw that back at me. But credit to the SEC, the University of Texas, and the University of Oklahoma. We're going to have an orderly transition, and that's why we're focused on 2025. So Sankey's public comments fall in line with all of that as well. Now, could something change and move this forward at the last second? I'm sure, and one of the things that does pop to mind for me is what happens when Oklahoma and Texas actually have to start playing some of these Big 12 road games, right? They have not done that yet. The first instances will come next week when Oklahoma visits K-State, which, yes, that will be a very rowdy and raucous and unkind crowd, I'm sure. And Texas will visit TCU. Now, for Texas, look, no offense to TCU. I'm sure there will be plenty of hostility there, but I don't think of TCU as being the most hostile crowd in the world. When you go to Baylor on October 30th for Texas, I think that really starts a string of difficult road games to end the year. They'll go to Iowa State. They'll go to West Virginia. Have fun with that in terms of people treating you nicely on the road. And I understand how you look at this and say, is that really going to have anything to do with it? But that's the biggest part of the whole awkward mess of leaving a conference is that you're dealing with the hard feelings, especially in the case of the Big 12. You're dealing with so many intense hard feelings that I think it will be pretty crazy. Remember, let's all remember this quote from Robert Allen, who's the Oklahoma State sideline reporter, and came on the channel in my radio show and had this to say about what to expect for Oklahoma in Bedlam this year in Stillwater.
I'm hoping it's as wild as it can be, and you know the geography of the field at Boone Pickens Stadium. The basically the benches are right up against the stands.
Yeah.
So yeah, if I got advice to any Sooner player and maybe even the coaches too, check out a helmet and don't take it off.
So could realizing that these road trips will be particularly brutal and seeing exactly how difficult it will be, not only competitively, but just from the words that are going to be slung to you from the crowd, et cetera, does that encourage people to open their pocketbooks and make this happen? Because remember, it would be very expensive. Both Texas and Oklahoma would owe approximately $80 million if they left early, and the Big 12 would hold their feet to the fire on that. They also are supposed to give 18 months notice. And if they're not going to, which they would not be if they're joining the SEC for next season, that price tag goes up. That goes up, much like we're seeing with teams from the AAC and the Big 12. So think about this. We're talking about those teams from the AAC leaving potentially for $17 million, somewhere around there, which is north of the $10 million price tag that is supposed to be there if you give proper notice. Okay, that's what happened to UConn. Paid $17 million, got out early. That's 70%. Do Texas and Oklahoma want to deal with a 70% tax on $80 million to get out by next season? They've got tons of money. I'm sure they could probably figure out a way to do it if they really wanted to, but that is a lot. That is a lot of money. So that to me is the biggest sticking point right now in terms of why it seems very unlikely to happen. And I continue to say 2023 because look, Texas and Oklahoma are not going to want to take road trips to UCF, to Houston, BYU, Cincinnati, etc. It will be more awkward when you're transitioning teams in and bringing teams out. And then on top of that, how does the revenue sharing work in all of that if you have 14 teams in the conference? That to me continues to be the date that will make the most sense. And I think the Big 12 will probably be a little bit more willing to work with Texas and Oklahoma on the logistics of that, the price, etc., if they wait until 2023. 2022, man, it would be such a tax on getting out on the $80 million because you'd be leaving the Big 12 in a lurch. They're not getting their new schools until 2023 at the earliest. You're going to be out early. There will be a year with 8 teams. That wouldn't look good for the league at all. So to me, again, I will reiterate, 2023 feels like the most likely scenario for Texas and Oklahoma. 2022 is definitely looking less likely by the day and certainly looks less likely after the SEC release their schedule without Texas and Oklahoma. Hey, if you want more information, follow me on Twitter at JL Kurtz. Follow me on TikTok and Instagram at John Kurtz Show. You can find info for my daily radio show in the description to this video. Plenty of ways to get more content from me. Please subscribe if you haven't. I talk college football every day. Right now it's realignment every day. I aim to give the Big 12 a voice. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll talk to you soon.